Now, the Metropolitan Police say that it will now take the lead in investigating sex abuse allegations against the late Sir Jimmy Savile as more women come forward claiming to have been assaulted by the television presenter.
At least 10 women have now come forward, either to police or in the media.
Who's your best pal? Tell me.
I'm not telling you. No, Desmond.
He's not.
He is.
No, he's not.
Get off me.
Because he's a married man.
Hi, it's Joey. I'm a paranormal investigator. I talk about spooky things and sometimes true crime. Today I'm talking about one of the most horrific people in British history, Jimmy Savile. My older generation probably has heard of him. The younger audience on my channel probably has not. If you don't know Jimmy Savile was an entertainer, DJ. He did a lot of things. He was well known and well loved by the Queen. He was actually knighted by the Queen, and he was loved by the Pope. This man worked in charity groups. Everybody loved this man, okay? After his death in 2011, though, things took a turn, and he was no longer known as this beloved man. On November 9th of 2011, many people showed up to Jimmy Savile's funeral. It's sickening to know how well liked he was. It's sickening to know that this many people adored a man that was a monster behind the scenes. When I tell you the streets were packed, traffic, yeah. So this gives you an idea of how generally popular this man was. It only took days later when stories started to erupt and the truth about Jimmy Savile was finally coming up front. And these rumors had circulated for years in his career and happened during the peak of it as well. Jimmy Savile was a rapist and a pedophile. On the 31st of October, 1926, Jimmy Savile was born in Leeds. Growing up, he had worked as a coal miner, and he ended up having to change career paths soon after. He started entertaining at nightclubs, which obviously took him to greater fame in the future. I suppose you could say that Jimmy was very charming. He was really good at getting himself noticed, which is what a lot of people try to do when they want to be famous and well loved. 1968, 15-year-old Marsden, Jimmy Savile's nephew, with 3 friends headed to South Leeds. They were looking for fun, you know, as teenagers do. They ended up at Houston Station and were approached by 2 men, and they decided to invite them back to their apartment. Jimmy Savile's nephew and his friends had no idea what the intentions of these guys. They probably thought, cool, these are older guys, let's hang out with them. But what they didn't realize was Jimmy Savile himself was going to arrive as well. Automatically, his nephew was thinking, okay, he tracked me down. It's been a few days. I've been trapped here. He's going to help me. He ended up showing up with also some children as well. Little did Jimmy Savile's nephew know that his uncle was supplying children. Yes. That's what happened. He ended up at the same place that his uncle was also supplying children to predators. This is just like one of the worst things I've ever heard of. You know, you hear about these things, but you just never expect it to happen to you or to be someone that you admire. His nephew was very naive and confused to the situation. His nephew said there was children from 6 to 10 years old at this place. There were parties at this place that would last for days, and it was typical that one or more children would be taken into bedrooms, and obviously they were sexually assaulted, raped, you name it, tortured. This is one of the hardest cases I think I've ever had to talk about. I mean, all of them have been horrible, but this one has got to be the cherry on top. Basically, you can call this pretty much a sex trafficking ring. And it was people of all kinds, you know. There are things about this that are so hidden, but yet in plain sight, that we don't see. These are multiple grown men taking advantage of teenagers, sexually assaulting children from 6 to 10 years old. The fact that this exists blows my mind. It blows my mind. How can anyone do something like this? At this point, the nephew was confused as what Jimmy Savile did in these parties, but we all know what he did. But he was unaware. After 1969, a year later, Guy Marsden, his nephew, returned to Leeds. He felt that he was lucky to get out of this situation in London, and he was. Jimmy Savile at this point was becoming extremely popular, and with popularity becomes privilege, and you are able to avoid things that most regular people like you or I, who just live their day-to-day life. It is a different world. You are in a different bubble from someone who has lots of money and is able to avoid prison. In 1968, Jimmy Savile was no longer really running nightclubs, but rather he was running the DJ scene, specifically at Radio Luxembourg. He ended up being a presenter at Speakeasy, and you know, he was gaining a lot of momentum at this time in the late 60s, and everybody knew him, everybody loved him. He was really good at making himself get noticed and more famous. After he was recording an episode of Speakeasy, Jimmy Savile offered a man named Dave a ride home. He decided to convince Dave that he was going to pull off into an area. He decided to go to a service station. Dave was like, yeah, okay, let's have a meal or something. He had no idea of Jimmy's intentions at this time. Dave went to go and get some food and left Jimmy, and while he was resting, he said he was tired from the journey. He was going to rest in the vehicle. He said it had been like, I don't know, 45 minutes. He came back and tapped on the vehicle. Two young girls, ages 14 and 15, got out of the car immediately. Let me tell you, this is a common thing. This is not just like some random thing. Predators know how to do this. So if you think 5-10 minutes, they don't have time, oh, that gives them all the time in the world. He said the young girls looked disheveled, and he said they looked as if they were trying to get away from something at this point. Dave was very suspicious, as he should have been. The girls didn't really say anything, they just went away. Obviously, as a young girl, you are terrified in a situation, and Dave gets back in the car. He says, "Who are they?" Jimmy said, "Oh, they were just fans. It happens all the time." And he was very quiet on the way home. This is a perfect example of being groomed by somebody who is popular. We've heard about these stories, we know about them. Dave was like, I need to talk to somebody about this situation because something does not feel right. Dave talked to Jimmy Savile's line manager, and he was like, yeah, we can't say anything about this. It's Jimmy Savile, you know, somebody that people just, I hate to say the word adored, but they did. Basically, their livelihood was at stake, and if they said anything, there it goes. Kind of like the Harvey Weinstein situation, which is why so many people did not come forward automatically because, well, things like this. Your livelihood is threatened. Dave said afterwards he refused to watch Jimmy on television. He was like, I'm done. This isn't okay. Which I am so grateful for men like him who actually comes forward and speaks up, because that is what a lot of young boys, young girls that go through these situations need. Even adults need this, you know. In 1975, Jimmy Savile started to host a show called Jim Will Fix It. This program went on for at least 2 decades. You know it was popular. You don't have a show run very long unless it's popular, clearly. It was said that obviously when Jimmy Savile was around children, on camera versus off camera, there was like a switch. Basically, he did not like children at all, and also did horrible things to them. People saw that he hated children, you know, off camera. He made a comment that all children should be eaten at birth. But what people speculate now is that he was creating this diversion because he actually did horrible things to children. So they thought if he hated children, he didn't want anything to do with him, that there would not be a suspicion that he was a pedophile. As we know how well loved he was on television, Jimmy Savile was also well loved because of his charity work. He raised millions of pounds for hospitals. One of the major ones that he raised charity work for was Stoke Mandeville and Leeds General Infirmary. So between the hospitals and his career, they both benefited from each other because these were well-known hospitals. Make no mistake, this man was very calculated. He was like, I am going to make people love me, and no one will even speculate what happened. Jimmy Savile volunteered at Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, where it was for the criminally insane. People that stayed there was Peter Sutcliffe, Charles Bronson, and Ronnie Cray. In 1988, he was even given a larger role there and had a house on site, where, you know, now he was able to have all this access. Yes, he was given keys to this place, and this is where the story, everything just gets worse and worse. Like, he had multiple keys, you know, he could do whatever he wanted, basically. So obviously Jimmy Savile was known from going to place to find his victims. Duncroft School in Surrey was one of them. You know, if you prey on vulnerable children, teenagers, that it's always going to be harder for them to tell their story. This is where predators go. They know who to find to keep their little secrets, or rather huge secrets. In 1994, 2 women at the school of Duncroft went to the newspaper and said that Savile had been abusing them. They weren't even asking for money. They wanted the truth to be known. Due to the circumstances of the case and how high profile, they did not proceed to do a lawsuit. This is what happens to victims, or survivors, rather.
Well, I think it's right that these women have the opportunity to tell their story. Many of them have tried before to talk to people, to report it, and of course nothing's happened with it. Yes, I accept that he isn't here to face those allegations, and I would like him to be here to face them. But the reality is, I think it's right that these allegations are out there in the public. After all, we know that those people who are abused as children, it's very unlikely for them to come forward at that point. And sometimes that takes many, many years later for them to come forward. And we know that speaking to these women, and indeed witnesses as part of the programme, there was a real fear, there was a real culture of fear about speaking out.
In my opinion, cancel culture has always been around. It's just in different forms. These women would have been completely canceled if they went to the full extent of destroying Jimmy Savile's reputation. So yeah, the Sunday Mirror did not end up publishing, which is tragic because perhaps that could have prevented things. I'm not blaming the survivors of the sexual assault. Everybody should come out in their own time, but I do think it's important to prevent further horrible things from happening. And you know, about this time, like, people were starting to catch what this guy was really about. It was kind of like an open secret, rather, by this point.
Esther Ranson, who worked as a television presenter at the BBC at the same time as Sir Jimmy was at the height of his fame in the 1970s, said there were rumours about the star.
I feel that we, in television, in his world, in some way colluded with him as a child abuser, because I now believe that's what he was.
In a statement, the BBC said it conducted extensive searches of its files to establish whether there is any record of misconduct or allegations of misconduct by Sir Jimmy during his time at the BBC. No such evidence has been found. Meanwhile, friends have voiced their disappointment at the ITV programme.
I was absolutely shocked when I heard this, because I was friends with him for a long, long time. We ran marathons together, was in his company for a long time. He hated anything like that.
I will tell you that Jimmy Savile had one of the creepiest smiles. He has a smile that looks familiar to me, that disgusts me. Another survivor of Jimmy Savile's abuse was named Stephen, and he even had abuse at a very early childhood age, from regular abuse to sexual abuse, which is, imagine being in your home and that was your growing up experience. And I know some people can probably relate. Over time, the abuse got worse and he was taken to a pedophile ring. And for approximately 9 years, he was continuously sexually abused in this pedophile ring. So this was like a constant thing, clearly. And Jimmy Savile was part of this sex ring and obviously abused him. He talked about how Jimmy Savile enjoyed seeing pain in children and made very horrific demands during this sexual abuse. He was an evil man. These young children were viewed as objects. They were not viewed as human. Stephen said that when he turned 16, the abuse stopped, which I suppose is like their age limit of when they stop being attracted. He did end up reporting it eventually, which had to be really hard for him. After the death of Jimmy Savile, it was only then the truth really came out. And it's awful that it has to wait before someone like him is convicted of horrific crimes. In 2009, Jimmy Savile was investigated because of the Duncroft school. The police was not very convinced, clearly, but they had to interview because it was not an interrogation. Of course, Jimmy Savile played it off like he had no part in the abuse at that school, and he made it seem like he would go after them, as far as a lawsuit. So basically, due to the lack of evidence, the police were like, meh. How many times am I gonna say that? Seriously. And the charges were dropped, ultimately. And of course, that was the last chance that anyone could have imprisoned him. Here we are, October, Jimmy Savile dies, and here comes about mid-December. The truth starts unraveling, right? So apparently there had been this come forward of women at BBC, and they had expressed the abuse of Jimmy Savile, and nobody was airing it. It was an investigation and it had been dropped, basically. All these newspapers were told the story of abuse and they all dropped it because they thought it would be in bad taste because he had just recently died, which who cares at this point? This man deserved every awful thing that happened to him. One man shared the story, Richard Ingrams. He was an editor of Oldie magazine. He decided to take the story, and this is when the truth came out finally. He published all the allegations in February 2012. This was the first time that all of the information was being published to the largest extent. So this was a big deal. It is said that over 450 people came out against Jimmy Savile on sexual abuse, which most were children. His abuse went to the extent of disabled children as well. And also it was said that even in the hospital, owning the pair of hospital keys, that he would also do things to the corpse of people in the morgue. Would you expect less from such an evil man? You know, there's a lot that was not told. I hate that this was the truth of Jimmy Savile. I wish it wasn't. I wish there was not a person like this. We live in quite a cruel world. Let this be known that people of all places, from all walks of life, are capable of anything. And we should always open our eyes to situations like this. Let it be known that Jimmy Savile was the worst British person in history.